Thank you very much. Well, Tim, it is a pleasure to come back again and to be asked to rethink about the same subject over 5 years, which is basically about the future of cities. And my proposition is that cities have problems, but they're essentially solutions to a lot of the biggest problems that the world faces, not just the UK. And I'm going to argue that we cannot carry on as we're doing without enormous social and environmental costs, but really we need to switch direction before it's too late. And I guess this moving image somehow gets into this notion that we're going to have to stop the cars and at least get across the street. So I just press that.
Press the down thing. Is it not doing it? What is it not doing now?
Nothing's moving.
Now, why is that? Oh,
yes.
right.
Okay.
Oh, well, is it this one that does it?
Yes.
It's that one that does
no,
it.
No, it's about me. No, which one does it?
No, I don't know what it is, but it's doing it now.
Okay, very good.
So let's do it and it'll work. Yes.
Okay, a little bit about me. I call myself a kind of economist because I've done economics at various places, but more fundamentally a strategic planner. And I would also call myself an urbanist. I founded my own not-for-profit in 1976, which went for almost 50 years, ending up as a cooperative. And then last year, the people in the cooperative then in Manchester decided it just wasn't worth carrying on and decided to just stop, which is very sad because I think a lot of people are, in a sense, losing hope that we can to make things better and that it's going to be worthwhile putting the effort in. I want to argue that it's not too late. I've written contributed to various books, which I'll refer to: Sustainable Urban Neighborhood, which is about building homes of the 21st century, and Good Cities, Better Lives, which I helped Peter Hull write, which is about drawing lessons from the rest of Europe. And we won an important prize in 2014 for showing how to build garden cities, which were visionary, viable, and popular without the need for government subsidy. And that was a very important criteria. And we showed how to double the size of Oxford and a city like York, simply by extending at the edges. And what I'm going to talk about today is why cities need to change direction, why we just cannot go on as we are, what the elements of sustainable development are, which you'll be familiar with, and then talk much more about how to switch direction, how do you bring about change, and what should be done in smart cities. And I've been working a bit in Cambridge, I'll refer to it, but also very much in southern India, which is Tirunelveli in Tamil Nadu. Fortunately, is there anyone from India here? No. No. But it's right down the bottom, it's hot. So why change tack? Well, the first reason is about 500 BC, I think, Lao Tse-tung said, if we do not change direction, we will end up where we are headed, which I think is a brilliant insight. But Mark Carney, who was governor of the Bank of England, now Prime Minister of Canada, in a book called Values, rather good book, said, we are effectively ignoring environmental degradation and species loss, while in the tragedy of the horizon, we are undervaluing the future, leaving a tragic legacy for future generations. And that business of valuing the future is absolutely key and what I think economists should be concerned with. And the awful reality, as Bill Gates pointed out, is that China, really been the fastest growing country, put more concrete up in 16 years in the 21st century. The USA did in the whole 20th century. So what happens in what we refer to as the global south is countries like India and China, Brazil, so on, are fundamentally important. And the best way to predict your future is to create it. So in a sense, I'm hoping that I will inspire you with the idea that as well as doing your work, you should be thinking about things you could do in addition to that to change things for the better. And don't just assume you should be doing what you're told to do, but recognize what is important. And however, as Mencken, an American humorist, said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So, and I fear that the missions that Labour has set for its own future may fall into that category. We've got to act together. Mark Carney again said we're all in the same storm, but not necessarily in the same boat. And as I talked to some of you, are you concerned about gentrification, you're concerned about housing, and this issue of inequality is pretty fundamental. And it's not just about being concerned about the poor, it's that the poor will mobilize and make life uncomfortable for the rich if nothing is done to change things. I've suggested that cities are solutions, not just sets of problems, and I've been writing a book on that subject. And one of the fundamental sort of insights is the notion that cities don't grow in a prearranged pattern like a jigsaw, but really rather like dominoes. And I use this in image on an authority about land assembly in London. And you'll find that as cities start to go in one direction, possibly around transport, certainly about things like water, the one thing tends to lead to another. And so understanding that pattern of change is important. And the fundamental thing you can change is transport systems. And land, of course, is fundamental to growth. Can't do development without land. But I would argue that it's not about having some perfect vision of what the future should be like, but it's seeing the steps, what I call balanced incremental development. I often like saying, particularly in India, how do you eat an elephant? Answer a bite at a time. In other words, you've got to take big problems and break them down into manageable chunks. And spatial planning, which I guess is what interests all of you, is a little like gardening, I would argue. I've just written another letter to The Guardian dismissing this idea that there are levers that aren't working and saying that development is much more like a garden, it's organic. And if we understand that you need to suit the context and enrich the soil and respect natural factors, we do a much better job than if we just thought that some mechanical intervention, dare say at high speed 2, for example, will somehow make things, provide the answers. And that's a building on the left, which is in Milan. I argue also that, and there were, in this first bit, I don't know why I seem to miss the framework of the talk, perhaps. I had at least two alternative versions of this, and I suddenly realized there was a later version, or sorry, a version that was more relevant that I used last year than the one I was working on, and so this is what you're getting. The master plan, we argue, is essentially a trellis. In other words, it's not a blueprint. It doesn't dictate where things happen, but it provides a framework up which a city can grow or evolve. And Ebenezer Howard, who first coined or used the term garden city, wasn't the first person, had this wonderful image in a pamphlet he wrote in about 1898-9 called Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Reform. You won't unfortunately be able to make sense of it, I suspect, but I do request that you have a look at it. And I think you've had shared a set of papers, articles called Building a Social City, which is this original concept, which has the plan in it. And it's the very simple notion that you have a hub city connected to a series of towns by high quality public transport with green space between, which can be used for a variety of purposes. I think if you decipher the words, you'll find there are homes for inebriates and waifs and so on.
That's right.
Things.
I was yesterday, actually.
Right, yeah.
I was talking about it yesterday, so everyone's...
Oh, familiar with that.
Yes.
And that notion, which we would now call a cluster of places, is, I think, a really powerful idea. It can be what we call a connected city, a string of places, like pearls on a necklace. But better still is when you've got relationships not just along one line, but to a series of places that are connected with each other. And as I was saying, transport is a fundamental key to unlocking the problems. And our growth model is inspired by this trellis. And cities can or should learn their ABC from places that work. And I've tried to compress this down into a memorable set of ideas. You've got to have the ambition to want to make places better. And many places are complacent, particularly those, dare I say it, run by conservative councils, who are too concerned about retaining the power of vested interests rather than looking at the needs of the wider being, or what we call people or well-being. So brokerage is fundamental, because you can't just tell people what to do. You've got to do deals, and you've got to say, well, you won't get everything, but you will get some of what you're concerned with. And if you're really hurt, you will be compensated in some way. But the C is the really critical thing. C can stand for many things. It could be collaboration. But I prefer to use the word continuity, because when I've looked at successful places, I'll be referring to this later, you find the key to success is just sticking at it. And the same people are in a position of power influence for a long period of time. I find that I say regeneration takes a generation, about 20, 25 years before a place is totally self-sustaining. Now, that I realize is a very long time to think about. And politicians, just think about the next election, or perhaps what the Daily Mail says tomorrow. Whereas what you need are people or a mechanism that can keep hold of that long-term vision. Unfortunately, there are places, and Cambridge is one of them, where that sort of approach has worked. And I'll be referring to a lot of continental examples. And these books, well-being is very much about health as a driving force. The Garden Cities of Tomorrow I've already referred to, Howard's pamphlet. And I think it's almost inevitable that you should come across the work of Jane Jacobs, who probably had more influence on our generation than anyone else. Who's read The Death and Life of American Cities? A few hands up. Well, I mean, she was very fundamentally concerned with the value of cities, quite ordinary places, which might otherwise be overlooked. And she was actually opposed to the idea of garden cities, which doesn't mean to say that one is right or one is wrong, but does mean that it's terribly important to look at the assets that you've got, including the heritage. Now, European cities, by and large, offer good models, and the best models can be found there. Not just in Europe. I've used examples like Singapore as a very good model. Vancouver. You can find Portland, Oregon. There are some examples in the USA, but they're relatively rare compared with the examples of what not to do. Whereas in Europe, for all sorts of reasons, we've had a culture of making the most of our cities and the heritage or commonwealth that they've inherited. In a book I helped Peter Hall write, Good Cities, Better Lives, and I brought along a copy in case you'd like to look through it. We draw lessons from a sort of Cook's tour around, and we say go to France to look at transport, look at Germany for economy, look at Scandinavia for what to do about conserving resources of different kinds. But if you want to look at housing models, the best place to go is the Netherlands, and I'll be returning to that in what I say. I think there are three priorities for green transition. I assume that we all like the idea that environment is important, nature, and so on. And that is, first of all, to tame the car, using examples like Copenhagen or Freiburg, which is in southwest Germany, procuring circular economies, and that may be a new concept, and I'll refer to Bilbao in the Basque Country, and then growing sustainable communities in the Dutch Phoenix suburbs. It looks like Vinex. And that was a program for expanding existing cities, which was quite successful. So let's talk about taming the car. And the first thing you can do is low traffic neighborhoods. You can, which of course can be unpopular, but people can get used to them. Prioritizing walking and cycling, because it's very hard to actually get more people to walk and cycle if they feel it's dangerous. So you've got to get traffic out. And charging for parking everywhere seems to me a fundamental tool which helps bring in the resources that cities need, but is also a very good way of changing behavior. And finally, to upgrade the public transport system with rapid transit and what we've called Swift Rail. So let's look at some examples. Copenhagen is Europe's cycling capital. And I guess who's been to Copenhagen? Well, proportionally. Well, I went to Copenhagen once as a guest of the cycling embassy, as they call it in Copenhagen, and they gave us a wonderful lecture about how they had improved cycling and provided space for cyclists so they weren't run over. And by the time they finished the lecture, it was dark and it was raining. We went out and rode around Copenhagen, and I felt quite safe. We then brought a group over from Denmark, and we cycled around West London, and in an area which is one of the best places in West London, and I felt quite unsafe. And it was just interesting how they've done a series of things. And one of the most important things was reducing car use in the centre so that over a third of trips are by bicycle. And the chief engineer, who I think may have been a Czech or Pole, progressively reduced parking in the centre. He did it by 3% a year. So that was enough over time to make a real difference, but never enough to really upset people. And I thought that was a very important lesson to understand how to progressively improve things. It goes back to the idea of doing deals or brokerage. Freiburg, which is a wonderful historic city, but which was totally bombed, except for the what you would think is the cathedral in the center. So what you see today has completely been rebuilt in the original form of the city, but with modern infrastructure. And what they've done is extended the city into new extensions. Rieselfeld is one, which was a sewage works, and Vauban is another, which was a military barracks. And these figures just show that over a period of time, the car use was reduced, the number of cars coming in stayed constant, public transport and different. So there are examples of cities which have achieved a transformation which should be highly relevant to cities like Oxford or York or Edinburgh, whatever historic cities. But it required leadership, and I'll be coming back to that. And it required this idea of sustainable urban form. So this is you can see the pattern of development within Freiburg. But what I'm showing you on the left is the development framework or master plan for this new suburb of Vauban, which is 5,000 or 6,000 homes. And what I love about this is they got all the rules onto one sheet of paper. In other words, if you look on the right-hand side, there's the sort of code to the principles that were to be used. And I rather than producing a vast book, as we might do, they got it down to one piece of paper. And that allowed many small builders and what they call Baugroup and building groups to take sites over from the local authority and commission their own designs. And so what you get is a superb variety of housing, not the same house everywhere, which you might get in a speculative development by a house builder. The second theme is procuring circular economies. And here, one of the most important things is to start with markets. And one of the ladies over there was talking about what had been done in a souk somewhere in the Middle East. And that, in a sense, cities are built around markets, but they may modify what they sell. For today, perhaps farmers market selling fresh food or whatever, or maybe selling old furniture. But the important thing is they're sharing and exchanging goods, and you have affordable workspace. Centres can become resorts. I'll be referring to an example, and innovation quarters, not isolated science parks. So often our views are misguided. People went out to the USA, I certainly did, and thought, yes, science parks, that's the future. But in fact, a firm which employs knowledge workers wants to be where it's highly accessible. And Microsoft moved from the edge of Cambridge to a site right by Cambridge Station, I think is a very good case in point. And the colleges are the motors or the engines for change. So whereas in the Middle Ages, it might have been a cathedral, which was the center. Today, I think it can be the college, which is why colleges need to be in the center of cities. And the economic base of a city is a sort of commonwealth. And if you look at different cities, you can see different features which make them distinctive. London has been called originally by a Danish author, Rasmussen, a city of villages. That makes London special. It's quite different from Paris or Berlin in that respect. And one doesn't want to lose that, but one wants to make the most of it. And in fact, we were commissioned to produce a sort of guide to how to make suburbs better. And insofar as many people in Britain live in the suburbs, I think one's got to think about how one can make them better places to live and change behavior. And that means working with this fundamental fact that great cities are polycentric. This is a map showing the centres of London, and they're not distributed around London. Along the main roads and along the routes that the underground system or the trams took. And this map shows the development area around those stations. And making the most of those and filling in the links, filling in the gaps, making sure that it's possible not just to get into the centre, but to get from one township to another is very important. And unfortunately, in the suburbs, the tendency is for people to use their cars to get everywhere, and then that leads to congestion and people complain, and it leads to worse health because of air pollution. So tackling that problem by making the most of a polycentric system is very important. Now, the Basque Country in Spain, northern Spain, is interesting because this was an old industrial area, mountains, which have really suffered in the Spanish after the revolution and so on. It was the fascist government of Franco took over, and I suppose the Basques still hung on to their cultural identity. But the important thing was that a Catholic priest promoted the idea of collaborating together, cooperatives, so that instead of businesses being owned by outside shareholders, they were owned by the people who work in them. And so whilst people may go to Bilbao because they're attracted by Frank Gehry's wonderful art gallery, far more important, it seems to me, is the way that you can get from one town to another very readily through a modern transit system. And the trains are built by one of the biggest cooperatives, which is CAF. And you'll see that quite a few trains in this country are designed and built by CAF. So cooperatives can actually become quite significant economic forces. The important thing is that they're owned by their workers, and they're not therefore just closed down because they've been bought by some American venture capital organization who's decided that they can make more money through developing the land than running the business. Another example of a circular economy, which is relevant to building sustainable cities, is the water model, which is used particularly in Hammarby Sjöstad in Stockholm to sort of guide their development. Now, very interestingly, all the energy in Stockholm in this development, which is, I suppose, 15,000 houses now, is kind of reused. So the water, the sewage, which is warmer, the heat is extracted and fed back into the energy system. And you've got a really innovative energy system. I asked the local authority, how did you get that? And they said, well, we just told we got utilities to bid, and we set the specification, and we picked the one that went along with our principles. And that idea of a local authority, the people taking control of their future and using a new development to pioneer a better way of living, if you like, it seems to me is terribly important. One of the ways in which the city can act as a solution. So what happens in Stockholm yesterday is then applied in another city today and others tomorrow. And that you can see the same thing happening in Cambridge, I'm pleased to say, which leads on to my third theme of growing better communities. So it seems to me if we are developing new homes, we shouldn't just be building it because it's going to make housing more affordable, because the awful fact is, however many houses you build, the house price, there'll be a fraction of the total housing stock, and therefore it won't really influence the price. But you can influence the way people live. You can certainly ensure there's a significant proportion that's affordable. And that, to my mind, means having different forms of tenure, having cooperative forms of living, not just private, certainly not just private rent. And it means densification rather than sprawl, building streets rather than tower blocks, garden settlements, not estates, and not just going for icons. And I'm afraid I'm appalled by the way that some magnificent tower, we said, oh, it's sustainable. When it's very hard to make a tower sustainable, you think, how are you ever going to reassemble it when it's reached the end of its useful life? You think about the problems that can arise if the lifts go wrong, and obviously we've got awful examples like Grenfell Tower to remind us that things do go wrong. So in my view, the fundamental principle which is used in all the cities which I think should be offering lessons are about building streets. And these principles are set out in a book called Sustainable Urban Neighborhood, Sun. And I'm pleased to say that we don't just preach, but we have practiced what we preach. This is one of the first master plans that Urbed drew up. It's just by Brighton Station. If you go into Brighton, look to the left-hand side, you will see a 15-acre site, which was the old goods yard and a locomotive works. And what's nice, this is actually an aerial photograph, but it looks identical to the plan that my colleague David Rudlin devised. And it started with the Sainsbury's, which wanted to build a larger store, and the idea of putting housing over the store. It seems so common sense, but it was revolutionary at the time. And I think that the sites around railway stations, particularly the station, sort of one station out from a city centre, are very important places to develop. And I would argue that's the place to start, partly because they're very visible, because the stations are invariably close to the town centre, and the town centre is almost invariably full of underutilized buildings. So they're a good place to start. And you can see this model being worked out in a place called Amersfoort, which is near Utrecht in Holland. And it's a middle-sized city. It's quite an ordinary city in many ways, which is why I like to send people there. It's about 160,000 population. Now, it doesn't have a university. Yes, it's old, but then I suppose most towns have old bits to it. But it's built 3 new Phoenix suburbs, and the one I'm showing there is one called Vatos, which is built to now about 11,000 homes. And quite importantly, they set out a framework and indeed a master plan with a series of distinctive neighborhoods. So I think there may be some with thatched houses or very traditional houses, some with very modern. They've got a new station put on the main line right at the beginning. Paid the railway company to put it in early on, and then next to that you've got sort of 20-story towers. So there are some towers, but they're not the general practice. And the result of the local authorities setting up a partnership with private developers and then borrowing the money from the state investment bank was that they were able to sell off sites to a variety of builders. I think never more than 150 homes at a time. So you get a real choice. And you can see that from this image taken from their visitor centre. You have a model and pictures of the different kinds of houses that are available for sale. And that's something I've never seen in the UK yet. And it seems to me it's the way to accelerate the rate of development, because if you offer a lot of choice, you can appeal to a lot of different market segments, the old as well as the young, the rich as well as the poor. And so you not only achieve economies of scale by doing the development faster, but you get a place that looks much better and goes back to my use of the term smarter. So it's intelligent because it's built with an interest in capturing value over the long term, but it also looks better. It's smarter rather than looking a bit of a mess or looking tedious. So smarter urbanization, this term I've used, involves 4 basic steps. And the first one is to apply what works. And I use examples like Cambridge and the lessons from Stanford and Silicon Valley, which I think have had to be adapted. I'm talking about revaluing hidden assets. So I think the key to doing development successfully is to look for things that have been overlooked. And that will change over time. When I started Urbed, it was a big thing to not just look at old buildings, but to look at waterfronts. I mean, it seems funny to think that 20, 25 years ago, people just could not see the potential in building homes next to water, overlooking water. Now, I think they can, but now it will be other assets that will be undervalued. Building alliances so that you get collaboration between interests, and then just do it, which is the theme I'll end up with. So let's talk about how you can apply what works. And this means applying what's known as systems thinking. It's seeing things, you know this term, I'm sure. But it's funny how politicians just don't seem to think in terms of complex systems with multiple objectives and risks and uncertainties. And it seems to me this is where digital intelligence can be so useful. And one of the good things about the growth of Cambridge has been that way back 25 years ago, the local authorities collaborated in drawing up a structure plan, and they commissioned people in the university, experts, to look at alternative scenarios. And these were tested out to look at their impact and to come up with a strategy with a range of elements in it, not just one thing. And it's that sort of approach which, in my view, needs to be applied much more widely. And in a sense, not so hard to do, because now with digital intelligence and this is not artificial intelligence, it's not leaving everything to a machine. It's looking at scenarios and then saying, well, what do we really care about? Is this more important than that? And in one part of the city, it may be the most important thing is improving affordability for poor people who already live there. In another part of the city, it's perhaps providing open space or creating a park, whatever. You can't really generalize, but you can apply this approach of mapping and modeling and looking at alternatives. Mentors and models, people I think learn from other people who are like them, and they like what they see. You know, seeing is believing, voir et croire, or something like that in French, I think. So I've put a lot of stress on the idea of taking groups of people to see things that work and then drawing lessons from them. And we've applied this in Cambridge. Learning curves, that's the notion that as you do things over time, you get better. I think politicians in this country at least have a forgetting curve. They progressively forget about what the lessons are from the past and repeat the same mistakes, which is almost criminal. And then colleges as engines for change. Well, let's look at a few examples. Now, this is a bunch of people from Cambridge. And the important thing is these aren't just planners and councillors, but they were people representing landowners and other interests. And we got them on their bicycles cycling around Bathurst. And I think when you can see pointing out things and discussing it with them, and they're learning together. So they came back with the ambition to want to not only build more homes, but to build something different from what had been built in Cambridge in the past. So that's the value of study tours. It pains me to say that we had almost managed to organize a study tour to Holland for the New Towns Task Force that the government had set up, and then it was ruled out, I suppose, because the Daily Mail would say, oh, what a government wasting time going to look at other places. And these views, I think, have suffered from the awful mistakes made over Brexit and this desire to sort of turn our back on Europe and create something unique, when in fact we should be learning from countries and cities which are similar to ourselves. Anyway, hopefully that may change over time. And out of those visits came one of the principles. There were 4 principles to do with connectivity, community, character, and climate proofing. These are the 4 elements of the Cambridge Quality Charter, which was the result of this series of visits. We pulled it all together in a report, and character was quite distinctive from what we saw. So this led on to the notion that if you invest in good design, it actually adds value. You can sell things faster, you can sell them even for a bit more money. I'm not saying that people will pay for sustainable energy systems. I think the awful truth is they won't. They're often skeptical. But I think if you make something that really looks good, then it becomes very popular. And one example of this, which is well worth looking at, is Marmalade Lane, Orchard Park, which was not a very successful development, and it was in a location which was an unpopular place, but it's got a more popular because it's a scheme which responded to the community. It was a community land trust, and the people effectively commissioned the design before they moved in. So you can see that, and it's one of a number of examples I recommend you look at in Cambridge, because it probably has more examples of what to do than, well, most cities in the UK at least. And that's showing people walking around Trumpington, I think. Oh, and I use this because we'd written this book called Sustainable Urban Neighbourhood. I love to think the term got picked up, but I then saw this poster for a scheme by Hills, who are particularly good builders, Sustainable Urban Neighbours Graced with 21st Century Period Homes. So at least they must have read the book or seen the cover at least. I talked about revaluing hidden assets. I know it's not easy to draw a picture of what the future should look like, but compared with actually making it happen, it's quite easy, because in the end, you've got to make the economics work. And cost of development over the whole picture over long term is the infrastructure, the land, but also putting in the energy, water, and so on. People get focused on just the building cost, and that's only part of it. So that making the most of what already exists is terribly important. And in my view, you need to look at and map waterways, including ones that aren't very visible, buildings, railway lines, and colleges. And this is a story of my own sort of voyage. I mean, I could have started with my experience of driving around the States, seeing towns where the center had gone and all the activity had gone to the outskirts. But that led me on to thinking how important it was to reuse buildings. And I was very inspired by what I saw in San Francisco, where the old chocolate factory had been reused as a series of specialty shops and so on. And I saw that for the first time how historic buildings by waterfronts were being reused. And I thought, couldn't we do something similar in the UK? So I started in a very modest way in a place called Rotherhithe in London's Docklands. And while I was doing my doctoral thesis, I focused on trying to start a number of projects to test out ideas, specifically with the idea that one could reuse these buildings so that old warehouses could be turned into workshops. And at one stage, there were several hundred craftspeople working in Rotherhithe who were attracted there. But the very first thing was taking an old engine house. And by the way, these things don't come with labels on them. I didn't see something called Brunel's Engine House for the Thames Tunnel. I walked down the Thames, and probably got on public transport as well, to try to find a place which I thought one could change. And this area, if any of you are interested, get to Rotherhithe on the Underground, and which uses Brunel's Thames Tunnel, and there's a pub called the Mayflower, and these are just by the Mayflower. And I saw that these, it seemed to me, were the size and a location one should be able to reuse them. I remember taking the chairman of Waits, of house builders, down to Rotherhithe. I met him at some conference, and I said to him, why don't you build some housing here? Look, there's the river, there's underground line, so on and so forth. And he said, you must be joking, because Rotherhithe was associated with criminal activity, and it wasn't seen as a desirable place. Well, today you would think it is a very desirable place indeed. And obviously it's more accessible through the investment in the overground. But it started with just reusing these buildings. And I remember that a guy called Richard Goodwin, who's a film producer, he made Murder on the Orient Express. He bought a warehouse just overlooking this Brunel Museum and turned it into his home, and his wife developed a picture reference library. Now, I use that example because I don't think he would have done it if it continued as a series of scrapyards, which is what it was, surrounded by sort of corrugated iron. So that business of starting in small steps by improving the environment, I think, is pretty fundamental and helps explain the transformation in Rotherhithe. Now, there are still, people of different classes and backgrounds and so on, but I think it's by and large seen as a success story. And indeed has influenced the developer of King's Cross, who developed Argent. And he very nicely in a presentation said that he tended to follow me around. So they're doing what was called Surrey Docks, now called Canada Water, and creating a whole new centre there. But first had done King's Cross. And I show this picture because it appeared in about 2014, I think, in perhaps in Town and Country, I'm not sure where it was published, but I wanted to show that we had come up with a scheme for reusing all the buildings that were there. And the particular issue was the demolition of this building, which you can see, which was the coal offices. And it was a derelict structure, and the owners wanted to knock it down. They were, and I persuaded engineers to show that it wasn't falling down. I persuaded architects to show how it could be reused and so on. The point is that over a 20, 30-year period, that sort of vision has been turned into reality. I got involved at some stage working as a consultant on the reuse of old buildings. I have to say I resigned because I thought that the developers were rather misguided. And they fell by the wayside. But Argent have done the right thing, starting with improving the environment. And now we had thought it would be nice to create a sort of dock again, but that was unfeasible. But the point is they've got fountains and the kids play in them. And I like to point out when people say, oh, gentrification, how terrible, the houses are very expensive. Well, the kids who play in that water come from the neighboring council estate. They're not middle-class kids, if you like. And I think that in some ways, it has provided for a range of people, including visitors to London and local residents. And I'm pleased to say we live quite close by, but in a council block on the south side of the Euston Road. And so when I thought, what have they actually done? I realized they turned this old industrial area into a resort. It was like Brighton. It was like, I'm trying to think of other resorts that you might like. Bournemouth, okay. The point is, there's activity, you can eat and drink and so on and so forth. It's a pleasant place to walk around. There's a lot of use of art, creativity and so on. And what was absolutely key is that the University of the Arts moved into that big building, the granary, as one of the first occupants. Now, I can't actually prove this, but I'd like to think that the reason that Google has set up their central offices there is because they've seen it as a place for creative people. When I asked the developer, Roger Madeleine, who are all these offices going, because that was what the original concept was, who are they going to be? They're going to be for lawyers, because all lawyers are going to have to move. As far as I know, there are no lawyers in the buildings, but you have got Google and you've also got people who design games and so on. It's become a creative center. But as I say, I think it started with the University of the Arts, and the University of Arts started there because he bumped into them and they were looking for a new home, and he was opportunistic and said, I can give you a building, sell you a building, I suppose. And that's being able to do so because they're in the buildings. And city centres can be transformed into urban quarters, and this is an example from Birmingham. I don't know that Birmingham is so well thought of at the moment, but the key point about Birmingham was that they had developed the sort of racetrack of seeing the car as king, and we had an event every weekend that shows people gathering, and we came up with this idea of a series of quarters connected by a high quality public realm. And a famous engineer, Peter Rice, who's been the engineer at the Pompidou Centre, coined the term the concrete collar. And and fortuitously, we not only had experts from around the world and local people, but we had key people in the local authority. And they were convinced by that to knock down the ring road, which they spent 20 years building. And so cities can switch direction. And that was very crucial because, in my view, without getting the traffic out of the centre of Birmingham, the idea of having Birmingham as a conference centre wouldn't have made sense. Nobody would have wanted to run a conference in the city, whereas today it's a very popular place for events. I think I'm getting close to the end because I want to now talk about funding a green transition. I'll go a bit faster. The important point is that you've got to tap the value created in the land when you're doing a major scheme and reinvest it. And I show how to do this in a pamphlet, sharing the uplift in land values. And we showed in our ideas for a garden city on the edge of Oxford that you could fund a new tram just out of the uplift in land values. And a good example is Copenhagen. And my inspiration for this is a French economist called Thomas Piketty, who wrote you remember Marx wrote Capital in the 19th century. Well, this is Capital for the 21st century. And he importantly says, change comes when the short-term logic of events intersects with the long-term evolution of ideas. In other words, you take advantage of a crisis and you say, we've got to do things differently, but you've already got the ideas around, like, say, land value capture. Now, I think we've got the ideas, and I'd like to think, well, I don't like to think that we've got the crisis to make implementing these ideas imperative. We can't just delay. And he also pointed out that property inflation is at the root of inequality because capital growth has outpaced wages. In other words, in a sense, however much you earn, you can never match the increase that's happened if you just happen to own capital, which is largely housing in Britain. And smart cities need to tap into that value and also invest in natural and social capital. And this leads on to the sort of final point, which is, yes, you need to use analysis. Yes, you use to design, but at the end, you have to just do it. And the guy who really is responsible for the success of Freiburg, Wolf Daeseking, uses just do it as the phrase. But I discovered that it was also the phrase that the shoe manufacturers just do it. And when I looked into Freiburg, more or less it's a 20-year period. He was a director for 20 years. There was a mayor, green mayor for that sort of time. But when I looked at Nike and asked, how long did Nike take to become the sort of world-leading shoe manufacturer? It was again about 20 years. So I take out those two examples. There's something to that notion that regeneration takes a generation, 20 to 25 years. Now, that's a very sobering thought, I think. It's, my view, absolutely vital to have pilot projects that show early results, to keep people happy that something is happening, which is why improving the environment in King's Cross was the first thing that was done. And it was what we did in Rotherhithe. 7 keys to green transition, and you'll have this presentation, so if you want to, you can look into these, but they're all things I think I've referred to in this talk, and you can look at the Wolfson Prize to see how this adds up in numbers. And perhaps this is, I think, my final example of in Oxford, we showed how you could build a metro, starting with just using the existing railway lines, the line to Cowley, which is where BMW make the Mini. It's taken 10 years since we won this prize to get them looking seriously at the Cowley line. The speed of change is so depressing in Britain that it should make us all, not just somebody who's getting to the end of his life, extremely angry, and to ask myself, why does it take so long? Why do we spend so much time just on studies that don't lead anywhere without the mechanisms for turning visions into reality? So smart urbanization should be common sense. And in the set of articles, Urbanism Reviewed, I show, if you like, or I go into more detail on some of these things. And this set of pictures, which I got an architect to draw up for me, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I do have colored versions of them somewhere. I think shows the story that I've been talking about. You start with a bit of wasteland, if you like. You find a derelict land. Nobody values it. It's the dump. It's not valued. And then you start planting things to grow, and you change the environment. And progressively over time, you get a sort of yield. As the trees bear fruit. So what I'm arguing is that if you can keep this organic model in your mind, ecological model, if you like, it's an important, I don't want to say that mechanical things don't matter or that financial things don't matter, but I think one also has got to think there's an organic process and this simple ABC of ambition plus brokerage and continuity. Now, this is where I get on to a second part, which if you had the appetite, which I could go into applying these lessons in the global south. But let's stop there. I've talked quite long enough and see, does that make sense to you?
What Pat will do while it's still recording, you can see if anyone has any direct questions for you, and then Nick and I will have a conversation, which we hope very much that you will join in on. Does anybody have a question on Kate's presentation before we move on to the next bit?
Something you couldn't understand or something you don't agree with? Yes.
I had a question about the new town task force, and I wanted to ask, what would you say are their current struggles and what solution would you suggest?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is I wouldn't recommend it would be with some. But at the very least, they've got to be urban extensions. I think that's the real. And you've got to draw what worked. So that included to develop operations, which I think they've adopted. The critical thing is going to be locating these in places which are favourable. And I just don't know whether they're going to it. I've argued that they should use digital intelligence. There's one of the people on the task force Grey Gang is very much committed to that idea. Because I don't think you should do what the previous Labour government did with eco-towns, which is effectively our sort of proposals, which are proposals from developers who've had their schemes turned down. Hope that they'll get them through the next time round. And the eco-town story is a dismal one, right? I think that if you accept that the urban extension is the only way forward, the critical question is land assembly. It's identifying the sites, getting the land, and paying the right price for it, which means you've got to change the principles of compensation. Now, the Syria Development Corporation should be able to buy if it exists in this value. So that's going to be absolutely, if they can get that through, that's going to be fundamental. I think, though, that it's going to be very hard to equip people with the skills required to do things relatively fast. And I don't think it's enough to just get every new prospective new town, a couple of 100,000 to employ some consultants who will do their work and disappear. You've got to build up capacity for long term. So I'd like to think that colleges, including places in Cambridge, would be running courses or to equip people with the necessary skills. I mean,
They're also, of course, big.
Right, which is doing what we did, as I showed you, taking the landowner along and so on and so forth. The very interesting thing, we started with a bus going to see things. We went to Letchworth, we went to Milton Keynes, etc. And then we started getting abroad to Holland and Germany. What I noticed was that first on the bus, the planners talked with planners and people in the private sector sat together. But over the period of time, they started talking to each other. And I think building up that trust and mutual respect is almost the most fundamental thing. In Britain, we have arrogance coming out of the sort of imperial past. We have contempt for other people. We don't seem to have the human skills as a whole necessary to make us, we're not natural members of teams. Now, it's not that we can't do it, so I think one has to invest in that. Whether the task force report will emphasize that enough, I don't know. I remember a bit of experience of doing some work on training project managers and arguing that the budgets for programs should allocate 2%, say, to training. And the civil servants said, "Oh, we can't do that because it means we'll have fewer projects." So that idea that almost training is a luxury.
Yeah, or that you're measuring by the wrong thing.
Yes.
And Nick, tell us the story about we were talking about a railway line in Norfolk where they wouldn't approve the station because the platform wasn't quite long enough. Is that what it was?
No, not my story.
Remember, it was only you. There was a place where we were talking about railway line extensions or bringing them back to life again. And in one of the stations, they didn't quite comply by contemporary standards, so they didn't do the whole thing. Do you remember that?
No, I think
20 yards too short.
I can use the example of a railway line reopening the line to Wisbech.
Yes, exactly.
Right, well, which is
That's the story.
okay. Well, the railways say that when they reopen the line, it's got to be brought up to modern standards. So you can't have level crossings.
That's what it was.
Level crossings people don't drive past the gate.